Hello, friends, and welcome to Scott Meyer from the Ed3 podcast, where we explore how to scale education using things like technology, Web3, and more. Today, we are so excited to have a city-loving, education-reforming, community-building leader with us. He is a deep thinker living across continents and inspiring change. He's built products for Galileo, augmented change with Paideia and Praxis, carried the flag as an ambassador for Notion, even though he uses Obsidian. And most importantly, he is the founder of City. That's cool. When he's not designing trusted learning environments, you'll find him reading, coaching, traveling. He is the best hunt since Brendan, your friend and mine. It's Serj Hunt. Welcome.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
It is so great to have you. Yeah, I have the honor of having weekly discussions because you're such a good curator. So I want to throw questions like you today on some of the big discussions and topics you're thinking of. And I thought a great place to be would be from a paper that I actually found thanks to you called Local Learning Ecosystems, Emerging Models. So it's written by Hanson, Thompson, Ward, and Gersford. And this quote stuck out to me. I thought I'd throw it at you and get your feedback. It says, across the globe, there's growing consensus that education demands radical transformation if we want all citizens to become future ready in the face of a more digitally enabled, uncertain, and fast changing world. Education has the potential to be the greatest enabler of preparing everyone, young and old, for the future. Yet supporting learning too often remains an issue for schools alone. So would love to hear your thoughts. Like, why is that truly the need and the challenge? And why are schools maybe not the ones to do some of this preparation?
Sure. Yeah, that is a really great paper. And if it's the one thing you read related to learning ecosystems, make it that paper. It's a really great analysis of just folks who have tried building these learning ecosystems before and explored different ways of designing trusted learning outside of its individual program, or just like how a school works, right? So that's what I'm really interested in. That paper brings together a lot of insights on that. And well, there's like another part here, which is to do with like why schools aren't that thing that can bring the radical transformation. Maybe I'll just start there. I think schools basically have this really difficult challenge. They're given like a very finite set amount of money, and they have to fulfill all of these functions, like be counselors, career advisors, help teens go through puberty, find you a job, like help you discover your interests, and at the same time, like get you market ready. And all of these things are just really hard to do with the limited budgets and staffing that schools get. So that tied in with the fact that most of schools' funding and their like ability to do good work is tied to their outcomes, this standardized testing. I think that's the like part that this radical transformation is trying to like tackle. That's this, I call this like the sorting hat, like of standardized testing, where I think the sorting hat is people are starting to notice that this isn't working for everyone. This one size fits all serves like a very small group of people who go on to like build the work ethic and, mindsets that get them into engineering or get them into be a lawyer or like get into some high paid jobs. So in the studies, it looks great. It's like, cool, grades do predict great outcomes for people, but not everyone. And so I think this is where the conversation is going to be really interesting, is like for those people who are like B grade students, but still have loads of talent and interest, where do they go? And, for the C grade students and below, maybe this just isn't the right environment for them. And so this is kind of where learning ecosystems start to like open up some more conversation, and Web3, right?
Yeah. Well, tell us what is an educational or learning ecosystem? Like what do you imagine being in that? And that's a term, that I hear you use a lot. So I'd love to have you dive into that.
Sure. Yeah. So learning ecosystems are basically networks of learning resources which can be adapted around a specific learner's needs or interests. And you can kind of think about these at various levels. There's sort of, the first time I interacted with one of these was like a corporate learning ecosystem. So inside BMW, there is one app and you can find mentoring and teaching and all the recorded classes and workshops that are happening in person, workshops that are happening online. And it's all kind of just available to upskill the staff at a specific corporation. So that's at like the level of a large corporate organization. But you can imagine this being at various other levels, right? you might have a learning ecosystem across a nation or like a really large bioregion. So one of them that often comes up is this one in Catalonia called Educació 360. And this is like after school programs for every school across all of Catalonia. It's awesome. But then you can also like scale down and go to like the city, which is where I focus at. So I think there's some really interesting things that happen with all of the different learning provision that's just available in cities. And then even further still to like a homeschooling co-op or like a group of homeschoolers who are just like organizing in a village or a town. So yeah, it's kind of the general sense of learning ecosystems. How do we tie together all of these resources?
Right. And I love taking it outside of the walls of the classroom, right? So how does, when you think about learning, it's like very much we have these hours in the day to do that. How do you allow people to take advantage of these other resources if that block of time is still required to be inside the walls? Or is that the problem? Do we need to break out of the walls during those hours?
Yeah. In general, I think kids are spending way too much time in school. Like if we, and broadly, their time is overscheduled, meaning if they're not in school, they're probably doing some extracurricular thing or like sports or generally like teen lives are becoming way, way too overscheduled. So it's like, where do you fit in all of this learning? When is it meant to happen? If it's not becoming a part of their after school, which is like the really easy entry point into their lives, then I think a couple of things are going to start changing, hopefully soon, but often later than we expect, where we see groups, either schools themselves, like reducing the amount of academic hours that teens need to be doing. And I can only really speak for teens that like at different age groups, it's going to be different needs and stuff. So, and I can speak to an example where this is true, which was in Austin called Alpha School. Or you're going to see like a bunch of new entrants come in like micro schools and different learning centers like Moonrise, for example, another called co-learning space. So these new entrants who structure time differently. So with the example of Alpha School in Austin, their whole sort of value prop is 2x speed academics. And they do this because they have an adaptive LMS, which basically measures how many past exam questions and puzzles you did per hour. And they just found out like if you drill these past questions, if you drill these like rote memorization things for 2 hours a day, you can spend the rest of the day like making projects and hanging out with mentors. And the kids still do really well. Sure, maybe this works for like some small group of kids, but you can kind of think about how that might be able to sort of be appropriate for like a broader audience down the line. So that's kind of more proof that we don't need to be giving kids all the same time because they're still achieving the same academic outcomes. There's some couple like rogue homeschoolers like Toan, who I interviewed for a podcast recently, who like did his whole high school diploma in like a year, just homeschool. It's happened quite frequently, but like less people talk. And they do it for some really like strange means, which I think is going to become more and more of a norm over time. That's where a lot of time is freeing up, is just like doing the academics, but really fast. And then, like I said, there's all these new entrants into ecosystems, right? So like micro schools and Prenda Learning and Kipod and do all that great work.
Yeah. And it kind of goes back to, what you said at the beginning, which is when schools' jobs are to be the floor and the ceiling, like we have to make sure nobody falls too far, but we also need to try to get people like to shoot for the stars. It's really hard to do both. And you can see why, if you want to guarantee that people have like a base level of education and they don't have support elsewhere, like we need them in the school, right? That's the best way to give them a safe environment and food security. But for people who maybe have that or have the, the advantage of being able to spend time doing other things, like that's probably not the right set, I think. And it's fascinating. Do you think there's an issue like with access? I'd be curious to tie that into, your project, just sitting in a school. So can we make this idea accessible to everybody, not just those who have needs? And how do you kind of think about that? So you can tell us a little bit about City as a school as you dive into that.
Yeah, sure. So different technologies will probably provide better access for different demographics. It's so context specific, right? It's basically what I'm trying to say. Like MOOCs were really good because they had auto graders and they worked for like the subjects that you can assess that are more programmatic, and the way you can prove competency for like more programmatic human competency. But they don't work for like cooking or football or something like this. So, then there's a set of technologies like AI is like this new thing that everyone's getting all hyped about. And that will be good for certain things, like adaptive tutors will be good for, or have been seen to be good for things like math. Maybe some more of like writing and humanities starts to touch into like AI learning. We don't know if like how assessment works there, but yeah, in general, different technologies are going to like provide better access for different groups. And again, like you look at demographics and price, that changes again and again. I think what we're trying to do at City as a School is essentially we have curated like a really good set of technologies. We don't need to be building them ourselves internally. I think HiPod also take this kind of approach where it's like, we did the research. We think these things would give your child, and like take it case by case. Because you come from this place and these are your goals, these technologies would like be cheaper, more effective, faster for you to achieve that goal. And this is kind of like filling in this missing function that schools don't have. Like they don't know what the best technology is often. They might know, but they don't have the career advisor isn't the one doing it or something. And so essentially it's coming into our hands to say like, hey, families who sign up and trust us, here's all these things you could be using. Maybe it's like what Bodo's working on, sort of turn any piece of content into active learning materials. And that's best for your goals. Or it's MOOCs, or it's something totally different, like more games and synthesis style things, right? So yeah, I think we're just approaching this from this kind of like concierge type approach at City as a School, and help you like think through that.
Yeah. So tell us, what is the pitch for City of a School? And then I'd love to hear your thoughts. I know you do a lot of thinking and researching on why ed tech has sort of failed to disrupt classrooms. And so I'd love to hear that tension, right? Of having kind of a platform and, tech startup potentially with this knowledge that tech hasn't historically. So tell us, what is the pitch, and then how you kind of square that?
Yeah, sure. So City as a School is at first a marketplace of live in-person and online live classes led by inspirational teachers. And we're only supporting teens, so 14 plus. Teens they can learn national curriculum. If there's a tutor that does that, they can start a business, or they can learn stuff that they can't traditionally find in schools. So no code or like data science. 3D animation in Blender was like our first sale. And so there's all of those things led by awesome teachers. Really, that's kind of like the bread and butter. You can imagine like Uber or Lyft has like their basic marketplace. And then we're exploring a bunch of sort of single player modes on top of this that sort of improve the baseline functionality of that marketplace and that ecosystem. The main single player feature for teachers is basically, how can I take payment anywhere, anytime, and turn any space into a place of learning? So whether that's like my living room, I should be able to have something that's kind of like Square and go like, great, 6 students, bing, 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 bing. Like they're in my class. I've got that all sorted, and like class management stuff. And for the learners, it gets a bit more exciting. We're exploring things like AI for learning. So again, we don't have to build all these tools, but we're trying to integrate them into the way that they're discovered. AI for learning, making sense of the world using AI. AI for creativity. We've all played with Midjourney and like some of these new models that are coming out. I really believe these are going to be great things for children to like understand more about like how they work. And again, I'll touch on this point, like if the right culture is around them. And then augmented reality for learning. So this is another like pathway that we're exploring, that we're looking at like Niantic game engine, which they use for Pokemon Go. So how do we turn like the built environment around us into a place of learning where people are authoring the different pieces of content, maybe in specific locations around the city, or creating interactive games. So yeah, that's more Pokemon Go for learning. But we're exploring all of those. But right now, the focus is just like the marketplace.
Right. And so one of the challenges with marketplaces and with, gathering instructors is what a term you've used, which is, trusted learning environments. So I'm curious, how do you kind of design a marketplace that has a guaranteed quality trust? And then, how are you kind of finding or assessing these teachers, I guess, to know that they are like engaging and educational?
Yeah, sure. So I think that the basic mechanisms which most people think of, which is kind of like your 5-star ratings
Mm.
and getting feedback from parents and teachers and stuff. In the UK, we have had the kind of like important law that if you're a tutor teaching national curriculum, you need to have reviews by 2 other people from the teaching profession. So like have a quality bar there as well for tutors of national curriculum. For those skills, and I think this is like a problem that both like these really native fields of like Web3 and like new fields in general have, is like, how do you start to build trust? Especially with very young organizations or young teachers, where like we don't know who the industry leads or players are necessarily. It kind of start to touch into like micro credentials and such. But my initial thought here is we need something that's not as linear or like single dimensional as 5-star reviews. One thing that's come up a lot is sort of like hex codes for trust, or like RGB for trust, where like color is like a multi-dimensional couple dimensions that we think are really important to like what it means that demonstrate trust in this person or their skill. A few folks working on that in England, and we'll see how that applies in general. But right now it's a lot of kind of culture, opportunity fit, like very informal, just like, do we see you as like a systems thinking, passionate educator? I think that's really where it's going to come, is like, do we have a trusting, safe culture to start with?
Yeah. And I know you've talked a lot about the mastery transcript, and obviously like credentialing and validating learning is something I'm really interested in. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on what is the mastery transcript, and then how do you think about documenting these non-traditional learning experiences or learning outside of the classroom? Like, how do you kind of see that fitting in now and hopefully as we move forward to the future?
Yeah, sure. There's been this huge tension between like, there's that monolithic and monopoly of just like credentialing weight that the schools and universities have had, right?
Mm.
In general, like I'm going to kind of like scale down, like I think this is like a 10, 15-year problem. I don't know if I used to be a lot more optimistic about this, and now I'm kind of, looking for sort of like
work.
like definitely it's just like, oh, okay. Mastery transcript is like a alternative form of high school diploma. It doesn't have like the GPA on it, which is kind of like the main reason why a lot of people are turning away from it. I think Sora schools were exploring this, and they decided not to give mastery transcripts because parents still think that, the normal academics, they do carry weight and they get you into Ivy League schools, and that's kind of what they needed. But it might not be for everyone. Like, I think the mastery transcript's interesting because it's not an A to F letter grade. It's a sort of A-star or not A-star yet type grade where you build evidence to prove that you have mastery in a thing. The school or the organization that partners with the mastery transcript set that criteria. They call it the credit model. And you say, create this credit model with them, and you say, like, this is what we believe mastery looks like, and this is how it could be evidenced. And then you just go and set off into the world and do that. So we explored using it as like, should we be the issuer of a mastery transcript where we say that like mastery in certain areas, like could be a basic skill like maths or English, or like more like a meta social skill, and sort of build our own reputational weight with that thing. That still doesn't feel quite good yet. I think there's something else which is at the intersection of all of this, which I'd like to explore. There's also the fact that like the mastery transcript is 400 schools use it to get you into about 200 universities. I might have those numbers wrong because that was like a conversation from a while back. But there's just this like sense that the credential doesn't really have much power unless it promises the outcomes that it says, right? Like, I think those 200 schools are cool. And there are a bunch of really cool universities that you can get into, like London Interdisciplinary School. Go check them out. Doing great work. which you can get into, but they have to be in like this avant-garde sort of like fringe area, or they're just maybe not less reputable universities yet, but that will just change over time. I think they're doing great work, and that they are trying to solve this problem of they started from this frame of like, how do you verify informal learning, and then had to take the more like academic route because it would get them the weight to then come back to this problem. But I really think this is kind of like the problem that we should be solving, is like verifying some kind of learning or not verifying it at all. I have a couple takes on that.
Yeah. So tell me your takes. What's the direction you're hoping City as a school might go in the short term and maybe long term? Maybe it's two different answers.
Yeah, sure. So the short-term piece is really portfolios. Like that's like after speaking to a bunch of folks who explicitly deal with like teen employment and like post high school employment. Everybody's been looking at the same stuff. We've all been like, no, it needs to be X API enabled with some cool protocol, which means that everyone could share the badges and they all move around and everyone just gets employed. That's really good. We really need that. Part of the bunch of problems there, mainly like organizational trust, like brand weight, like Google micro-credentials are just like the best ones. And until other organizations figure out how to get brand weight, again, coming back to reputation. Sorry, I'm going off on a little bit of a tangent. I was talking about what we're going to do in the short term. Portfolios. Like this is still like the most routine way to get you a non-academic job, like proof of work, essentially. Document what you do, bring all the code, bring all the text, bring all the writing, the videos, the presentations that you did. Reflect on that and bring it into a sort of presentable way. So that's the near-term target. The long-term target, I think, is much more in line with what Bodo Onin is working, who you've had on the podcast. And I think Bodo's approach ties into, Bodo's really working on sort of infrastructure for assessing this learning. Like it's very like layer 1 type stuff. I tend to think about like sort of layer 2, like what does it mean to navigate what Bodo's working on? Maybe we could both try and articulate what Bodo's working on, because it's probably one of the more interesting aspects of all of this. The way I understand it, at least, is like there's a non-human readable set of relationships in all of the world's knowledge on the internet. Like one way you can think about this is what people have tried with triples, which is kind of like semantic relationships between like Elon Musk is CEO of SpaceX, and these are like nodes, and SpaceX is a venture-backed company. Like what does venture-backed mean? So you have this like deep relationship of like nodes and entities from the web. And Bodo's trying to think about like, what is it that build these relationships? Because it's not just triples and those semantic relationships, there's other types of relationships in here. So this really like rich picture of the internet is called sort of the concept map, or like the underlying relationships. But then there's also this doing layer. So there's the concept map, and then there's the doing map. And on the doing map, it's like, how do you build up proof of learning towards each of these concepts? So like, how would I prove that I knew osmosis? Well, like I could bring you all of this code, all of these presentations, all these things that I did. And I could also tell you like how they're related. And so the steep structure is like relating to the assessment. And that's kind of where Bodo's starting to work at. Something I'd like to focus on is like, how do you make this really navigable and stop people from, this is less to do with like assessment. Maybe there's a part of assessment in here. I think the way that we're going to navigate that is something like a web browser cross with a note-taking app. It'll kind of feel like, imagine moving around an Ocean dock, but each page has a Zoom room attached to it. So you can find the people who are also looking at this, or there's a community related to a set of concepts who are all proving that they know this thing. So you're in these like these digital communities of like people who relate around certain concepts, and they're all like part of a lineage of like where they're all like trying to figure out where these concepts came from and like demonstrate that they learned them. One other thing I think is going to start cropping up is like the ability for sort of these communities, whether that's like a large community, like IBM, like wants to get involved and say like, hey, this set of concepts is the IBM field of like how we think what we think our engineers should know. And that chunk of it is that. And like, we're going to set up some assessment around this. Or if it's just like a group of really nerdy friends who everybody knows on Twitter and is like, they're the people you speak to about strange topic X. Yeah. Where like, we'll have this thing called like in-group assessment, essentially. It's just like really small group assessment. You can upvote and downvote if this thing looks like that. And like, in reality, like if I'm a musician, I want other musicians to validate my work because they're the ones in the field and they generally have the best sense of like what good music, and they have taste as well. You could combo that with something like more meta or more like general, where like there's some out-group assessment as well. But I think in-group assessment is helpful, maybe not for getting like the certificate weight, but at least as a mechanism for me to understand that I am on the right path as a learner and like then understand more about myself and like be able to move forwards from there. So yeah, giving us like assessment into the hands of like in groups, I think is going to be a really fun thing that starts to crop up. You see it with like already with like Thinkific and these basic LMS type tools. But it's always missing this component of like the deep relationship to the concept of like the ontological map that kind of gives us a new way of thinking about like deep structure rather than being like, oh yeah, you just made up some framework and now you're assessing me against that rubric.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. It's almost like it's the same thing we do in higher ed where we have accreditation boards, right? And these are people who are the in-group for these slower moving topics. So like what's the equivalent in fast moving, maybe less academic areas? And
sure,
with the added benefit that like they have the social networks to connect learners to as well if they wanted to, right? So like not only do you know this, but you'd really get along with this person and now you're off on building the next step of the learning, which I think is really powerful. If we want to educate the people around the world at like a sufficient level, we're going to have to use technology to get there. So I'm really curious about how you're thinking about that. Cause I know you mentioned AI learning tools as an area of interest and you talk about it now with grading. And so just thinking about what does that look like to reach more people or maybe help people augment their learning? So yeah, I would love your take on kind of where that's headed. And is that now? Is that 10 years? Is that like, what do we need to do to get there?
Yeah, I think this is like already happening in informal and kind of messy ways. I'm really pro getting people to focus on building culture rather than technology. What I mean by culture is like a set of norms and practices that enforce the culture and, you know, sets of behaviors, which, you know, you can think of all sorts of mechanisms to like support them. But I think the missing piece here is always culture. And what I see in schools is, and of course, your point of freeing up more time for the teacher. I still think this is like probably the best thing we can be doing right now. I don't see a case where we just put a baby with an AI mentor and it suddenly becomes like the next Galileo. That doesn't like, relationships are the key here. I think like the people you surround yourself, like everyone's heard this like 5 people you surround yourself thing. You become a product of those 5 people. That professional network you build, the groups that you move to and then from, and the way you individuate yourself and develop character because you decided to leave a group, that's all super important. Yeah. And you don't get that with like speaking to a robot or like a chatbot. Free up more time for the teachers, either by doing things like what GT Alpha School are doing with this thing that like makes sure that kids only have to do 2 hours and so they can focus on building culture, or like AI mentors, which give more time for the teacher just to be like a facilitator. And they can then again focus on building culture and like creating safe places and like bringing cool ideas into the room. And I think that's really like the big bit here is like, how do you get more competent, inspiring role models into the world. So much of this learning is like happening through our mirror neurons and just like imitating behavior, especially at younger ages. So yeah, just give teachers way more time to do good work. And I think that's where technology is going to come in. And it's really hard for teachers to adopt these things because they'll get domesticated by like the traditional practice and not be innovative. So like whatever the goals are of like school, because they haven't broken away from school culture, they just get taken in and then try to achieve the goals of school culture. But like, I think all the innovation is going to happen when teachers can spend less time in school culture and, move to these other places and go like, well, what are the goals that you want a group of kids who are not trying to like ace the test? And when that question comes up and you've got these competent, inspiring teachers who have time, they can think about the culture around a specific set of tools like AI mentoring or whatever it is that comes up, VR, AR. And then that's where the transformation is going to start happening, is groups of teachers doing this.
Yeah, that's amazing. The power is back in the teacher's hands, hopefully. Well, as we kind of wrap, what's kind of the big question or debate you're thinking about right now in the space, whether it's coming up through City as a school or just personally? Are there topics that, our listeners should be thinking about or diving into or weighing in on to kind of create this future?
Yeah. One really big one is kind of like a question that's come up a lot in Montessori circles. It's related to kind of how much free roam, self-exploration, like totally interest-led learning one should be doing versus like, for a time that comes up here, like propaganda, like kind of let's force them to do this thing. Especially when some people are believing that they've found like the quickest way to do a certain topic, and that like by not giving you this propaganda version or like these recipes, as I sometimes call them, like just do step 1, step 2, step 3. Like, how do you balance all of these things? And I think Montessori started to speak to this a little bit, where she believed there was like a core set of skills which gets people up to basic like ability to deal with the environment that they're in. And you should just teach them that, like you just get them through it. And then after that, you don't really need to be doing much else besides teaching sort of meta skills and like communication and like how to network and these kinds of things. So I think this is a question that's coming up a lot for me. It's just like how much interest versus how much like do the step by step because we figured it out.
Yeah. It's like take the medicine and with the spoonful full of sugar, right? Like get the hard thing done and then go explore. Well, this is so great. And I love that you're helping people do that exploration. So tell us real quickly, best ways to follow your journey and your writings and where we can learn more about you.
Sure. Yeah. So the place I'm most active on in the internet is Twitter. You can find me at Serj, Serj Hunt, HUNT _ARK, ARK. That's where I'll be blah blaring a lot. Cityasaschool.com. So city ASA school.com is where you can sort of discover more about the work that I'm doing. And if you want to dive into more of like the way that I think about the world, there's a link in my Twitter bio, which goes to sort of some public notes, which you can, drift through at your own sort of speed.
It's amazing. Well, I encourage you to reach out to Serj. He's not only brilliant himself, but has a network of amazing thinkers that I've been blessed to connect with. So I thank you for curating the people around these concepts because we're going to create the future together. And like you said, the more you get into it, the slower it feels. And so we need that encouragement as well to stick with it. So thanks so much for joining us today, Serj. And we'll look forward to learning and reading everything you're doing online. Good luck.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me, Scott.